Hi, welcome to the breakdown of this project. I actually created this project a little while ago, but never did anything with it. So I posted it on Reddit a few weeks ago and it did pretty well over there. So I decided to create a little video on how the process went and what I did to create this scene. I started out with a basic cube. I beveled the edges and made it a bit uneven, and I also put a little edge on top. After this I duplicated the object 2 times and made it slightly different than the other ones, so it looked unique. I basically did the same thing for the sidewalk. I duplicated the object using the array modifier and then put a displace modifier on it to make it a bit uneven. I blocked out some other simple shapes and positioned the camera how I wanted it. I saw this technique in another video. That's where they rendered out the viewport and then bring it into Photoshop to sort of paint the textures on it in Photoshop and then project it back on the mesh in the exact same view that you had rendered. This technique worked surprisingly well, to be honest. You have the freedom of mixing your textures easily without doing the whole node setup. I think this is a similar technique that they used on the Netflix show Arcane. I did the same thing for the sidewalk, but it did not look as good as the walls, so you will see I replaced this later on. For the lighting, I wanted to make it look like the sun was shining through the city buildings. So I created some simple skyline mesh and set up a sunlight to shine through it to create the shadows. The wet road that I used in this project was from an older project that I never did anything with, but it came in handy for this project, so I decided to use it. The skyline shadow thing was pretty basic, so I extruded some parts and inset some parts to make it more believable. As you can see, this looked way better. Here I decided to add some leaves that I think it was used from the Bagapie add-on, and some grass on the sidewalk as well to make it look like there was some grass growing between the tiles. The background sky is just a basic plane that I used from, I think it was Unsplash, and this immediately gave some life to the scene. There are some other things that I added, like the pigeons and the columns that the pigeons sit on. I think these were from Ian Hubert's Patreon. To create the sun rays, I decided to not use a volumetric cube, but just create the sun rays using an emission shader. This combined with the noise modifier makes some really believable light rays. Next up was the graffiti. I created this in Photoshop just with a basic graffiti font. I know a lot of people say this looked a little bit unreal, but I couldn't find another way to create this and it looked good enough, so I decided to use it. I combined this with the Shrinkwrap modifier on the mesh on the wall and it looked good enough. As I said earlier, I was replacing the sidewalk with some photoscan sidewalk that I made in my backyard. I'm glad I did that because it looks way better than the sidewalk that I created using the individual tiles combined with the array modifier. The only downside of this method is that you create a lot more geometry than needed. So if you're using this for animation, I would optimize it. Next thing I did was ask my girlfriend to photo scan me using the Polycam app in a bit of an awkward position. I was supposed to look dead or shot, I don't know. But I was quite surprised with the outcome. It looked pretty good. And then it's just a matter of cleaning up the mesh a bit, positioning it in the scene, and that's it. I also used the Bagapie add-on to add some trees and vines on the wall. I did the same thing for my backpack or my camera bag. I scanned this with the Polycam app as well and placed it in the scene. Usually these scans come out pretty rough, so I put a smooth modifier on it. And sometimes I bring up the shadows as well in Photoshop of the texture of this object. This way you delight the scan a bit, so it's easier to use in a 3D scene. I downloaded some flowers from Sketchfab, I think it was, and placed these around the victim. That was basically the whole scene setup. One important thing that I didn't record was adding the spray can. This was just a model I downloaded from Sketchfab and placed in the scene. After this I rendered the scene out, brought it in Photoshop to start the paint over. Honestly, there wasn't much paint over to do. The only 2 things that were important was for me to show that he was killed during the spraying of the graffiti. So it had to look like the spray can fell down and it was somehow still spraying when his hand went down. This was achieved with a simple white brush, and I think the layer was set to overlay. I added the famous blood spatter. There was a bit of a discussion on Reddit that it was not possible that it was sprayed on the wall this way. I don't know why, but it looked good this way, so I decided to keep it. Maybe it's just the composition that looked good. This was just a basic red blood spatter on a black background, so it was easy to cut out. I've played around with the blending modes a bit to get the desired effect. Now it was just a matter of color correcting. Usually what I do is just create a gradient map and then use the blend if mode to delete parts of the shadow or highlights, depends on what you want. So I usually have different gradient maps for the highlights and shadows, and then also different colors. So I think this is the basic breakdown. It's just a quick overview. It's not really into depth or into detail of what I did exactly, but it's to give you an idea on what I used in the process and how I created this scene. I just wanted to keep it short and simple, so I hope it's useful for someone. So thank you for watching and see you in the next video.